Welcome to China Power. I'm Bonnie Lin, your host, and in this podcast, we dissect critical issues underpinning China as a global power. Today, I am joined by my colleague, Dr. Kristi Govella. Kristi is Senior Advisor and Japan Chair at CSIS. She is also Associate Professor of Japanese Politics and International Relations at the University of Oxford. In this episode, we will discuss the latest developments in China-Japan relations, particularly following the escalation in tensions between the two countries after Prime Minister Takaichi's comments on Taiwan late last year. So, Kristi, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Bonnie.
So I'd like to start off with the question of what have you found most surprising about China-Japan relations so far this year, or I guess in the past year or so?
So sadly, not much has surprised me about China-Japan relations this year. So since tensions began to ramp up after the comments you mentioned by Prime Minister Takaichi in the Japanese parliament last November, things have really been on a negative trajectory for Japan and China. And you and I wrote an article together in early December of last year, saying that it would be difficult to de-escalate the situation and predicting that tensions would continue and probably worsen. And unfortunately, that has proved to be true. Beijing has kept applying increasing pressure on Japan because they viewed these comments as highly provocative and because they're trying to craft a narrative about what Japan is doing on self-defense. And, things really have been steadily ratcheting up over the past few months. We've seen a steady increase of Chinese pressure on Japan across a variety of tools, ranging from economic restrictions to military exercises to pushing political narratives.
So when you look at the range of tools that China has used against Japan, is there anything that you've seen China use or not use that surprised you? Like, for example, when we were looking at it last December, I think we thought that China might escalate across the board. But I don't know if we were specific enough to identify anything specific that we said would happen or wouldn't happen. But as you look at the range, was there anything that you saw that was kind of out there you didn't exactly expect that within this overall trend of increased Chinese coercion?
So I think if we look at how things have evolved over the last, half year or so, basically we've seen a lot of the same moves used that China did in its previous bouts of tensions with Japan in 2010 and 2012. And for those of in the audience who may not have looked at our previous article, basically the point was that we were looking at these previous episodes of tensions and trying to outline a playbook for escalation measures. And the idea was that, Beijing already has a number of moves and we'd likely see some of the same notes used this time around. I do think actually that is holding up relatively well. So prior to early December, Beijing had mostly focused on diplomatic opposition to Japan and trying to push a political narrative of Japanese wrongdoing in various parts of the international community. But we really hadn't seen much economic and military response. And at this point, we really see that Beijing has taken things up a notch across all of those different areas. But I would still say we see some signs of restraint. It's definitely the case that Beijing's playing a long game with Japan. And so instead of like a dramatic, broad-based offensive where they just cut off all exports of rare earths, we see a very gradual and deliberate ratcheting up. So on economics, we've seen export controls on dual-use items and technologies. On diplomatic side, we've seen actually probably the biggest push in terms of trying to reframe Japanese defense policies as new militarism. And then militarily, we've also seen an increase in maritime activity as well as joint flight exercises, et cetera. So I think that across the board, nothing that new, but used in a very calibrated way. Probably for many in Tokyo, I think the economic restrictions have been top of mind because they're impacting a wide range of companies. But this is something that Japan had been preparing for based on past experience.
And when you talk about relative restraint, what measures were folks worried that China might use that we didn't see? Like, what is Tokyo view as restraint so far?
Well, I think that when we look at past instances of Chinese pressure, there were more broad-based restrictions on rare earths exports, for example. And I think that now we do see that. We see China being very strategic and trying to hit Japan in particularly strategic areas. But there's still much further that they could go. So to recap, in January, for example, China banned exports of dual-use items to Japan that could be used for military purposes, which included rare earths. And that's a big thing for Japanese supply supply chains, both for defense and for commercial industries like automotives. So at that time, it was pretty vague. But then in February, we saw that Beijing announced 20 specific companies that were put on an export control list for dual-use items. And then there were another 20 that were put on a watch list. And many of the companies that were listed are ones that are involved in shipbuilding, production of aircraft and maritime equipment, like Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, Kawasaki Heavy, Fujitsu, etc. And so we saw that in February. And then in June, we saw, again, the ratcheting up of another 20 companies being added to the export control list and another 20 being added to the watch list. So I think that that's different than putting a broad-based restraint. Does it still affect Japan? Yeah, it definitely does, in the sense that if you look at data, there was a report earlier this year by some of our colleagues at CSIS that I think they said exports of these dual-use controlled products fell almost half, something like 43%, and that rare earths were down almost 80%. So it does really hit Japan, but it's still not the same as a more broad-based set of controls. In general, Japanese companies are being affected, but this is also something that Japan has been preparing for basically the last 2 decades by stockpiling, investing in alternative resources, promoting technology that allows people to recycle rare earths, etc. So it hasn't hit as hard as it might, but this is also not a long-term solution. So we don't know how much that Japan has exactly in terms of stockpiles. Many analysts think it's about a year, but the longer this goes on, then the idea is that it will probably have a more dramatic effect. So right now, I would still say it's rather calibrated, but it can still get much worse. And I think the Japanese government is well aware of that. I've seen some estimates that a more broad-based cutoff for something like a year would reduce Japan's GDP by 1.5%, and that probably the strategic importance would be even bigger because of the way that these critical minerals are integrated into key supply chains. So I think things could get much worse. That's the sense in which I think there is some element of restraint here.
So, Kristi, you've broadly mentioned how Japan has responded, right? You mentioned repeatedly that Japan's very prepared. Japan's taking all these measures to find alternative supply chains. But what have you seen as the direct Japanese response to China? Have we seen any tit for tat or like a Chinese measure, economic coercion measure that Japan has responded to by taking similar measures? Or has Japan's, response also been restrained very to diplomatic protests, but not too much beyond that?
In general, Japan takes the position that it does not engage in economic coercion. It does not exchange in, tit-for-tat retaliation for these kinds of things, whether they come from countries that they consider to be increasingly adversaries like China, or whether the coercion comes from allies like the U.S. Japan is of the opinion that no country should be engaging in this type of behavior, and so it very much wants to toe the line and adhere to what it considers to be a very important international rules-based order. Instead, you see Japan calling for support in the international community. You see public kind of attempts to shed light on what China is doing to make sure that these efforts are transparent. And for Japan, you do see actually relatively direct refutations of things like the political narrative that Japan is engaging in militarism that China has been pushing back on. So you don't see Japan engaging in economic coercion. You more see defensive measures like diversification, like trying to strengthen alternative relationships without breaking the rules that it considers to be so important to international governance.
I do want to follow up on your point of the Chinese accusations of Japanese militarism. I do want to have you unpack that. But before that, I do want to ask, to what extent are you seeing all these tensions in China-Japan relations really impacting the bilateral relations between the two countries? Has it, for example, limited cooperation, limited engagements? What does that actually mean at the political level?
At the political level, things are pretty cold between Japan and China right now. I mean, the tensions are clear. Pressure is increasing. I think that things have been on a trajectory of worsening for quite some time, but this is the worst it's been for probably a decade or more. So concretely, that means that, people are feeling the pressure at multiple levels of society, whether that is people who are traveling for the purpose purposes of tourism, companies who are trying to do business across borders. Certainly at the official level, there is not enthusiasm for meetings. Japan at various diplomatic levels has maintained that it is willing to engage with China, but we haven't really seen that kind of engagement. So it is relatively cold at the moment in both countries.
So going back to the point or the accusation that China is making that Japan is militarizing. So what we saw late last year was China was using that as the foundation of some of its anchor of criticism against Japan, and then using militarism also as the rationale for sanctioning different Japanese companies that were involved from China's perspective as militarizing or contributing to Japan's defense. What is your view on China's take there? What exactly is Japan doing? And do you actually view Japan as going anywhere close to anything beyond becoming a normal country in terms of its military?
So perhaps unsurprisingly, I do not agree with the Chinese narrative of Japan's behavior. I think it's very clear that from Tokyo's perspective, these are really defensive actions. And to unpack what it's doing a bit, these are things like increasing defense spending to 2% of GDP, acquiring new defense capabilities, relaxing restrictions on defense-related exports, etc. A lot of these things Tokyo sees as necessary to defend itself in an increasingly dangerous neighborhood at a time when it may be able to count less reliably on allies and partners. So, I think that it's one of those tricky offense-defense lines that gets blurry. But from Tokyo's perspective, all of these things are being done to really prepare it for a world that is increasingly dangerous. And when people in Japan look at the current situation with China, it really seems to justify these actions to domestic audiences and to Japanese elites. So, for China's part, it's trying to frame Japan's changes in defense policy as threatening and expansionist. And it's really trying to make the case that Japan is pursuing something akin to a new militarism and evoke memories of Japan's World War II legacy. It's even, tried to make the case that Japan is trying to pursue nuclear weapons, which is really not the case. We had an event recently at CSIS talking about our survey of strategic elites in Japan and South Korea. But, the research that we've done, and also, if you just look at the public discourse, there's very little appetite for acquiring nuclear weapons in Japan and very little of discussion of it even. There's been no change to, Japan's non-nuclear principles or some of these core things. So, I think that when you look at this political campaign, it's not very convincing to most countries, and I think that most countries are also familiar with the kinds of pressure that Japan is facing now. So there's a degree of awareness and empathy. When you look at who is really signing on to this narrative, you see really the countries who are doing so are Russia, North Korea. I think there was a statement by Beijing and Moscow in May, I believe, that about Japan's remilitarization, quote unquote remilitarization, and how it posed a threat to regional peace and stability. But in general, this is not something that has wide uptake. It's been reported in some places that other countries have been mentioning so-called militarism in a variety of joint statements with China. I think there was one with Pakistan, Myanmar, Bangladesh, Mongolia too. But if you look at those, they basically denounce militarism, and they don't name Japan, which I would say is a rather more limited sign of support because nobody likes militarism or fascism, of course. So I would say that overall, there's not a really convincing narrative to most, and Japan really has been active in trying to make the claim that it makes a peaceful contribution to the international community, to try to be transparent about what it's doing. And that's in public, and in private, it's also trying to really strengthen relationships with partners and make sure that the trust is there.
In terms of Japan taking these defensive military measures, I do want to point out or have you discuss a bit from Tokyo's perspective. What about Chinese military activities near Japan or around Japan that Japan views as most destabilizing? We've obviously seen a whole range of it. That includes, for example, activities near the Senkaku Islands, Chinese naval and aircraft moving closer to Japan, and of course also China's joint military exercises with Russia around Japan. From Tokyo's perspective, is there one set of activities among the large range of Chinese military activities that Tokyo views as most problematic, or I guess raises the most attention within Tokyo?
So I think as a whole, the trajectory of activity is alarming to people in Tokyo. If we take, for example, the area around the Senkaku Jiayu Islands, that has been an incredibly congested, contested area in terms of the presence of maritime vessels, presence of Chinese maritime vessels in the area. That's something that Japan has been tracking again for, the last 2 decades. We've seen reports that presence is increasing. It's basically all year round now, but it's even more close to all year round. Numbers are increasing. There was a recent face-off between Coast Guard ships and from Japan and China just in early July, where each claimed that the other's vessels came into their territorial waters. So for Japan's side, they claimed that 2 Chinese ships had basically approached a Japanese fishing vessel, which is relatively rare, actually. And then they were supposedly driven off by the Japanese Coast Guard. So, that's all very alarming. I think that, one of the things that gets the most attention is actually the increasing cooperation between China and Russia that has been really highlighted. I think, again, this is something that Japan takes to be part of a sign that its neighborhood and indeed the world is getting more dangerous all the time. So if you look at Japan's defense white paper that was released last year, I think it mentions China-Russia cooperation something like 50 times. And, that was one of the reasons that was stated for moving forward the review of Japan's 3 key strategic documents. So Japan is currently revising its national security strategy, national defense strategy, and its defense buildup program, which really form the core of national strategy for the country. And so that's something that's been highlighted. One thing that we have been discussing in recent events is, for example, a joint bomber exercise by China and Russia, where those have been going on again since 2019, but they've been increasing in frequency, coordination. So in December, there was an incident where 2 Russian bombers and 2 Chinese bombers, they basically joined over the East China Sea, and then they passed over Japan's Southwest Islands, which is relatively normal for these exercises. But then they turned toward the direction of Tokyo and then flew more than 600 miles or so, which is farther than they had ever gone before and seemed to be sending a clear signal. So these things, I think, are the ones that have been gaining the most attention because I think they signal to policymakers the ways that threats from China are increasingly intertwined with other threats and that they're getting more and more complex to deal with. So I think it contributes to this sense of Japan being in the worst security situation it's faced in decades.
Yeah, I saw those maps of the Chinese and Japanese bombers towards Tokyo. And the way I saw it drawn on the graph was basically in the direction of Tokyo and then turning back to give the message, but not moving too close to Tokyo as to further alarm Japan. And relatedly, in early July, we saw China launch a ICBM-1. And there were conflicting reports in terms of where it was launched. There was one reporting where it was launched somewhere off of China's Shandong province, and another report where it was launched from the South China Sea. And when my team graphed the navigational warnings that China released for the 2 missile launches, one would have had the missile fly over parts of Japan before it landed closer to Fiji. And then I know it seems like what actually happened was the missile was launched from the South China Sea and then overflew parts of the Philippines. But I know the Japanese government responded quite strongly to this. What is your sense of how this was perceived within Tokyo?
I mean, I think this was perceived as another piece of bad news in a bad situation. So, I mean, you're correct. Japan issued a statement basically saying that they had serious concerns about China's increasingly active military activities. So really framing this as part of a larger trajectory in Chinese assertiveness. And they also mentioned, lack of transparency about what's going on and really tried to frame this as a concern for not only Japan and for the international community. So I think that, for Japan, obviously these kinds of threats from China are often particularly they make a particularly big impression because Japan is close to China. Japan is, having increasingly strong tensions with China. And so every time that China demonstrates one of these capabilities, it really sends a signal, particularly at a time when Japan's facing tensions, but also it's not really getting a lot of support from the U.S. In this situation. So I think that, both the sort of concrete implications for capabilities and also the symbolic importance were not lost on people in Tokyo.
It was interesting watching some of the Chinese media portrayal of this because you had commentators because there's a debate what delivery vehicle was involved, and some were arguing that the delivery vehicle was the one displayed during the September 2025 parade last year, which was, as you know, a war of anti-Japanese resistance from the Chinese side. And it seemed like some of the commentators were trying to portray this as not only a demonstration of China's capabilities, but anti-Japan, which is not surprising. I feel like a lot of military activities right now in China, there's incentive to portray it as China using that against Japan in some way or another.
Yeah, I think that's very right. I mean, Japan at the moment is the target of a lot of this sentiment, and that is something that Tokyo is very aware of.
So one thing I wanted to ask you is you've talked about how Japan is thinking about all the ways to respond to increase its resilience against these types of Chinese measures. To what extent are we seeing Japan work more with the United States and other U.S. allies and partners in response to what we've been seeing in at least the last 6 months or so, escalated Chinese pressure against Japan?
So, as I was saying, I really do think that this pressure campaign from China really reinforces the perception in Tokyo that Japan really needs to do more for itself independently, and also in terms of building ties with others. And so, what we've seen over the last half year, really, over several years, as Japan has begun to perceive increasing levels of threat from China, is that Japan is reaching out to new security partners to try to strengthen relationships. We see increased cooperation at various levels with countries like the Philippines, Australia, South Korea, NATO countries, for example, and then also trying to double down on its relationship with the U.S. and strengthening the U.S.-Japan alliance, which remains really the key component of Japanese defense strategy when it comes to thinking of various contingencies. So obviously, Japan has had a number of challenges with its relationship with the U.S., particularly since the beginning of the second Trump administration last year. But we have seen Japan actually try to come closer to the U.S. to try to stabilize that. And I would say that actually among U.S. alliances, the alliance with Japan has been, relatively stable, all things considered. So I think that this is a trajectory that Japan has been on for quite a long time, but the current moment is really just accelerating and emphasizing to Tokyo that this is what needs to happen. It needs to happen faster. It needs to happen to a greater degree than ever before.
So when Japan looks at countries beyond the United States, is there a sense of priority which countries to focus on? Is it, for example, the neighbors most close to Japan, like Philippines, Australia, or is there a greater prioritization of, for example, NATO or other countries? Do you have a sense?
I think that, really the strongest sense in which there's a priority is that obviously the U.S. is the core of defense policy for Japan. I think when it looks at other security partners, it's really looking at its individual relationships with those countries and what they have to offer. I think, for example, when it looks at the Philippines, it sees a country that is facing a lot of pressure from China as well, in a very key strategic area that Japan sees as having implications for its own interests, maritime interests, as well as its territorial disputes with China. So I think that, there are incentives at the levels of strategy as well as, operational capability, norms and rules with the Philippines. I think when it looks at Australia, there are a number of different kinds of incentives, including defense industrial base cooperation and other elements that come into play. So I think that I wouldn't say that there is necessarily among U.S. allies a priority for Japan, because I think really they see the need to strengthen relationships with everyone. And even when you look at key partners like India, you see Japan really trying to strengthen relationships at a time when U.S.-India ties are not so good. And so you see energy devoted there as well. So I think Japan really is taking a very broad and expansive approach. And I think that to the extent they can, they're trying to do everything, obviously, but it's not so easy.
And can I ask about Taiwan, since Prime Minister Takaichi's initial remarks about Taiwan was what really pushed China over the edge? Have you seen more willingness on part of Tokyo to showcase more support or do more with Taiwan in the last 6 months or so?
I think that the recent tensions have certainly, again, reinforced the sentiment amongst many in Tokyo that this is something that needs to happen, that Japan and Taiwan need to do more. I think that basically the strategy remains one of trying to quietly cooperate with Taiwan and trying not to obviously agitate the situation with China in order to avoid feeding further into the narrative that Japan is trying to interfere. Although, various things have happened over the last several months that have been taken as such by Beijing, and they have been accused of doing so. But I think on, a quieter level, there is an acceleration of conversations about, what Japan can do in contingencies, and trying to think more in concrete terms. There's still a lot more than could be done, I would say. And I would say that's also not just in terms of defense cooperation, but also in terms of things like economic cooperation, strengthening Taiwan's resilience in various areas like infrastructure. So I think there's a lot that can be done. And I think that increasingly Japan sees that as in its interests. I also think when you look at public opinion polling, Japanese people are much more aware of the importance of Taiwan for their own security and the way that these things are interconnected. So in general, I think we're moving towards that path, but it's still a rather gradual journey and probably almost certainly slower than many in the defense community would like.
I guess one question from your perspective in terms of looking at what's driving this increased Chinese coercion against Japan. Obviously, we've talked about the specific issues that China's trying to respond to, or what they believe to be issues, right? Prime Minister Takaichi's statement on Taiwan, what they perceive to be Japan moving more towards the direction of investing more military capabilities. But is there also a larger Chinese assessment about the state of U.S.-Japan relations or the state of U.S.-China relations that you think might be underlying this? I don't know if I heard you or another colleague mention this recently about the possibility that given the fact that U.S.-China relations at the strategic level might be a little bit more stable, that might provide more room for China to engage in more provocative actions against Japan. I just want to get your thoughts on how do these two relationships, the U.S.-China, U.S.-Japan, as well as, of course, China-Japan, how do these two really affect the China-Japan relationship? And from your perspective, from Tokyo's perspective, to what extent are the dynamics that we're seeing right now creating incentives for China to perhaps push Japan more than China would have under normal circumstances?
I think that was me who you were calling. So yes, I do think that it's important to consider beyond the bilateral how relations between the U.S. and Japan, the U.S. and China are playing into this. And I think it's almost certainly the case that China is seeing the current moment as an opportune one to test the waters in terms of pushing Japan. I mean, there's been a lot of discussion this year about the meetings planned and already conducted between President Trump and Xi, and how those are creating a situation where there's the potential for movement in U.S.-China relations, but also a situation where perhaps the U.S. is unwilling to create waves in the U.S.-China relationship for the rest of the calendar year, perhaps longer. And so I think that this seems to create a window of opportunity where policymakers in Beijing may feel like they can test how far they can push Japan, particularly since the U.S. up to this point has not really said a lot in terms of support for Japan. There have been a few things here and there, both in terms of actions and words, but the U.S. has been relatively quiet. So I think that there is a theory that now is a time when pushing Japan will not necessarily provoke retaliation from the U.S. I mean, on the other side, I would also say that if you look only bilaterally at the U.S. and Japan, we've seen some pretty strong, I would say, optics and substance from President Trump and Prime Minister Takaichi about the strength of the U.S.-Japan relationship. The interesting thing about the current administration is that it's not contradictory to have productive relationships with China and also strong alliance relationships with Japan, even at this kind of time. So I think you see, a complex dance, but I do think that the desire for stability in the U.S.-China relationship is probably creating more room for tensions between Japan and China. I also think in some ways, if the relationship between the U.S. and China worsens, then China may not be so eager to antagonize Japan to this extent, just because it's a difficult thing to be engaged in conflict with all your major neighbors and trade partners. So I think that, things could change if the U.S.-China leg changes. So that's really the big wild card in this situation, I would say.
Okay, 2 final questions to wrap up this podcast. So first, what do you actually expect or predict might happen in China-Japan relations in the next 6 months or so? Is it more or less the same, continuing escalating tensions, or do you think there's a point in which maybe things might reverse?
So unfortunately, I think de-escalation is unlikely while Prime Minister Takaichi remains in office. So I think that, my prediction would be that the best we can hope for is avoiding further escalation. So basically just holding on to the current level of tensions. I mean, I think on the Chinese side, as you know well, Taiwan is the heart of Beijing's core interests. So that makes its position relatively hardline and difficult to change. China has also made it clear that it views Takaichi with deep suspicion, and there is no love lost there. On the Japanese side, I think that Takaichi has tried to make the case about her original comments that they were not a change in policy. She's tried to say that she's willing to engage, but that really hasn't made any difference. And there's really widespread concern amongst Japanese elites and citizens about China these days, as I was mentioning before. So really, the current tensions with China, pretty strikingly, are not affecting Takaichi's support ratings. Those have come down a bit since her really big victory in February in the snap election, but they're still relatively high. I think in late June, her cabinet support rate was something like 68%. So, people are not punishing for her at the polls. So I think basically what I would predict is that, both sides have relatively hardened positions and they're unlikely to back down. So without a change of leadership in Japan, because we're not likely to see one in China, then you don't get that reset of relations. But, we could also see an increase in tensions. I would predict that China will try to keep it calibrated because they want to still leave room to go further. And I think that at some point, if they really expand things like the rare earth export restrictions dramatically, then that will, basically trigger perhaps a bigger response than they're looking for. So, yeah, not a great prediction, but I think that's probably what we're looking at in the coming months.
And final question related to that. You mentioned what you thought would be possible in the best case, and you said that was not de-escalation. But what do you view as possible in the worst case? Like, how bad could it get in the next 6 months?
I mean, like I said, I think that it will continue with this kind of gradual ratcheting up that we see, with more companies perhaps being listed on these export control lists or watch lists, with, repeated attempts to try to frame Japan as engaging in new militarism with, increased exercises. I think it's very unlikely that we'll see a dramatic escalation, but if we did, I would probably say that we'd probably see it in the diplomatic and economic realms. So perhaps some kind of I think they've already, pretty pushed the narrative pretty far in terms of what they're trying to do. But in terms of economics, again, we could see a broad-based expansion of these export restrictions, which then perhaps, they would try to use as leverage to get Tokyo or the U.S. to do something to have them removed. So, we could see that. I think that's the most likely form of escalation I would anticipate is on the economic side, because they know that hurts Japan, and because that in some ways is not as likely to trigger some kind of kinetic conflict.
Thank you, Kristi. I know it's always hard to make predictions given how fast things are moving, but really appreciate you joining me today to share your insights about China-Japan relations, where Tokyo stands, what moves and actions Tokyo has taken, as well as your general assessment of what's happening and regional and perceptions within the region. Thank you so much, Kristi, for joining me today.
Thanks.